in such a forum, I really want to make a few very general remarks, but also to connect it a bit more specifically to the research I'm currently doing, but allowing for the possibility that people may want to discuss or ask questions about other issues related to history. So I was asked to talk about, from a historian's perspective, about migrants, narratives of migrants and on migrants, and collection, analysis, use and dissemination in public discourse. So after a few general observations, and I can say a lot more about the historiography if people are interested, I want then to connect it to some current work that is on my mind. So let me begin, since my approach is often informed by interdisciplinary perspectives, by quoting a remark by the Canadian human geographer, Jennifer Hindman, who in one of her books says early on that theorizing mobility begins with people's stories and histories of migration. But what form do these stories take? How are they framed? By whom and to whom are these stories told? What happens if they're not fully heard or understood or believable? I'll come on to the question of believability in a moment. But one of the things that I liked about Hindman's initial statement is that there is a history to unpick here. And we learn, for example, although this is well outside my, my specialist field, that in studies of Huguenot refugees who arrived from France in England in the late 17th century, that Huguenot refugees were expected to testify before co-religionists, other Protestants in England, with what was called a reconnaissance, or a narration that, in the words of one historian, required or obliged each fugitive to become a storyteller. And this reconnaissance was a condition of being accepted into the fold, into the community. So I think this little vignette is a way of reminding us that there could be something very urgent about having to narrate one's displacement, and that the stakes could be considerable. Well, then if we think about the forms of narration, of course, this exists in a very extensive kind of list, if you will. Personal correspondence, official records, songs, poems, drawings, photographs, film, theatre performances, and that's just a small selection of the different formats in which one might expect to find narrative. Like migrants themselves, these narratives are scattered and sometimes secreted and sometimes lost. And where oral testimony is concerned, of course, historians who don't have that kind of material at their disposal have to look elsewhere beyond the testimony that's vouchsafed to an oral historian. But methodologically, I think the questions or the issues are quite similar. That's to say, in the case of refugees, what are refugees willing to disclose? Under what circumstances? And whom can they trust? And so there are gaps and silences, whether we're thinking about the testimony that's collected, for example, by an oral historian, or testimony that might be expected to be produced in front of an asylum tribunal, for example. And this could reflect an unwillingness to talk about difficult, perhaps traumatic events, or it might, as some theorists tell us, be a tactical decision to retain a level of power and control within a system that is largely built against them. So following these sort of quite general observations, I wanted then to invite you to reflect with me on the kind of issues that I'm currently working on, and that's to consider records that are held in the archives, records and archives of UNHCR in Geneva, which from the 1950s, early 1950s, from the beginnings of UNHCR through to the mid-1970s, amounted to something like 25,000 confidential case files. So these are letters, petitions and such like that individuals wrote either to UNHCR in its different offices, branch offices, or to Geneva itself. And the key point I wanted to make, and I think that is very relevant to the ITHACA project, is that this is a kind of narrative encounter, that there are connected narratives, that there are letters and so forth produced, crafted by refugees who wanted access to and the assistance of this emerging and quite powerful organization. But then alongside these this kind of material, you have the response, you have the observations and the reports and so forth produced by eligibility officers, for example, whose job it was to decide whether this person was or was not a refugee within the terms of the 1951 Convention. So it's possible by using this kind of material to try and understand or to gauge the narrative aspects or the narrative dimensions of this encounter between refugees and this specific agency. And it's possible then to understand how the terms of the encounter might be established within the framework of what comes to be called the international refugee regime. And refugees were therefore expected to adhere to particular sorts of conventions, or if you like, templates. And in that respect, refugees in this particular context, bearing in mind the framework established by the 1951 Convention, were either expected to or did present themselves in relation to ideas of persecution, since that was inherent element of the 1951 Convention. And in that respect, refugees were then required to present an account. It was supposed to be consistent, it was supposed to be credible, and then UNHCR would draw upon this material to establish a kind of guidance or a record, or if you like, a kind of precedent for further discussion or for further investigations of the next refugee who appeared in front of the officers. So this is what I mean by a kind of narrative encounter. So then it won't come as any surprise to realize that these narratives, and like these case files, don't follow a prescribed kind of route. There's a very complex picture that one can build up in which refugees certainly talk about persecution, about violence, about loss, but also about the kinds of many odysseys or journeys that they undertook. And this might be composed in terms of an adventure rather than pure kind of loss. And certainly one has to interpret this material, and this won't come as any surprise to people in this project, in relation to differences of gender, of age, of class, occupation, and ethnicity. And so you find in this particular example that refugees might well write in English as a major diplomatic language, or in French, as well as in their native language, or they might choose to go in a different direction and write in Esperanto. And so you get very rich material here. Sometimes the tone is one of supplication, but not always. Sometimes it's determined, even belligerent, sometimes sarcastic. And it's not always about the tone of the narrative. It's also about its content. As I've already indicated, refugees might be talking about a history of persecution, but they might then go on to say, I want to assert my rights. In other words, make a kind of political claim. Sometimes they even drafted imaginative solutions for their plight, going beyond the established legal formulas and thinking about imagining a world where there might be a state for refugees, for example. And also, they might locate their own personal narrative in a broader framework of persecution of an entire group or an entire nation. And that is one way of thinking about this in relation to the politicization of narrative, that the narrative doesn't float freely. It's embedded within particular sorts of political contexts and sometimes political demands. And I think this then links to another theme that I think is emerging or may emerge in the ITHACA project, which is about migrants and refugees who are not just making their presence felt within a particular context or a particular system or a particular regime, but who are creating knowledge, knowledge that they might be able to share with one another about the nature of that regime, what works, what doesn't work, what the possibilities are, what possibilities are closed off to them. And I think that whole question about how knowledge is generated and disseminated is an ongoing agenda for many of us. But then the other part of this is what narratives the officialdom create towards or of migrants. And of course, they're trying to build up a body of case law, if you like, of precedent. And they certainly do that. And they create manuals for eligibility officers that have kind of illustrative examples of the cases that they've considered. But of course, the other dimension to this, if we think about the narrative encounter, is that officials are also wont to make ad hominem comments about the people that they come into contact with. So they're not just saying this person has a valid claim, they're saying this woman is hysterical. This student from sub-Saharan Africa, I don't believe him, he's making it up. So, part of this narrative richness is also the kind of commentary that officials feel themselves able to make. And then just one or two more points I wanted to make. In relation to the situation of refugees, I'm conscious that I'm looking at a particular time period. But some of the issues, the broader issues, are of current concern. If you think about the work of the anthropologist Didier Fassin and his work on what he calls the precarious truth of asylum, this is something that I think is of pressing concern today. In other words, the narratives that refugees in the current situation are expected to make, and the extent to which they may or may not be able to advance a credible claim. But this is all a way of saying that the issues of claim and credibility are bound up with a political context. So it's important not to lose sight of that as well. And lastly, I wanted to say something about ethics, because there's an uncomfortable aspect to looking at this material as a historian, and the discomfort comes from the fact that you are intruding into quite intimate matters, as the eligibility officers were doing at the time. And it's confidential material. So in relation to the project, which is interested not just in analysis, but in use and dissemination, one has to be incredibly careful, because the people who pass through the files may still be alive. Certainly their descendants will be alive. So it's important to respect issues of confidentiality and privacy. And yet at the same time, for the historian, there's something very rewarding and very exciting about being close. There's a distance of time, but there's also the closeness and the kind of intimacy that oneself has in relation to people who presented themselves. So I think these are crucial issues that one has to think about relating to the collection of material, to its analysis, to its use, and to its dissemination.